I filed my first dispatch from the viewport of Shuttle Kinneret at 0614 on the morning of the first day, when the Thurval Ascendancy's orbital platforms released the initial kinetic column, and I watched a city I had visited twice disappear from the face of a continent I loved. I want to be precise about what I mean when I say I watched. I did not watch the way a person watches a fire from across a street, where you feel the heat and can taste the char. I watched through 48 centimeters of reinforced composite viewport at a distance of approximately 380 kilometers, at an altitude where the curve of Earth's atmosphere made the continent below appear peaceful and abstract, a thing painted on the inside of a bowl. From that altitude, a kinetic strike column, a cluster of 17 dense metal impactors released from a high-energy delivery rail in geosynchronous orbit, arrives at the surface in what appears to be silence. The composite viewport was good enough that I could see the flash of terminal impact even at that altitude. It registered as a brief brightening in the lower left quadrant of the landmass. It lasted perhaps 2 seconds. Then the brightening spread. I was a correspondent. I had been one for 22 years. I had filed from 3 ground conflicts, 1 off-world labor dispute that turned violent, 1 catastrophic hull breach on a deep mining platform, and the first and only documented case of an alien vessel attempting unauthorized extraction of a human research team from the Vorek survey station. I knew what it was to watch something happen that you could not stop and to make yourself useful by watching it precisely. You owe the record your precision. You owe the dead your attention. You do not look away. So I did not look away. I pressed the recording stud on my correspondence tag, and I described what I saw in the flat, instrumental language I had developed over 2 decades of trying to tell true things. I said, first impact column registered at 064 local shipboard time, targeting what visual analysis suggests is the metropolitan corridor bounded by the Kellarn River Valley. Flash of terminal delivery lasting approximately 2 seconds, followed by a heat bloom spreading outward approximately 60 kilometers in what appears to be less than 30 seconds. I am unable at this altitude to determine casualty figures. The platform that delivered the column remains in visible geosynchronous position. I count additional platforms. I am counting them now. There were 9. I filed that dispatch into a channel that had been dead since the Ascendancy's relay blackout had taken effect 6 hours earlier. I filed it anyway because that is what you do. You make the record whether or not the record has anywhere to go. Someone would eventually find it in the Kinneret's data cores, or in the backup array in my correspondence tag, or encoded in the automated ping my equipment sent every 4 hours to an emergency archive relay that the Ascendancy had not bothered to locate and destroy. You make the record. The record is the only form of dignity available to someone watching from 380 kilometers up, while 9 orbital delivery platforms begin the second day of what their own broadcasts were calling the Thurval cleansing rite. I should explain what the cleansing rite was, because the word requires precision, and I was, above all things, a person committed to precision. The Thurval Ascendancy was the 4th largest political entity in the local sector, measured by inhabited systems. Its theology was older than its fleet program, and its theology held that certain categories of world were spiritually contaminated, rendered impure, by the presence of what their doctrine called unreconciled life, meaning life that had not been brought into accord with the Thurval understanding of cosmic order. This was not a casual designation. It required formal review, documented petition to the Ascendancy's high sanctum, the signatures of 6 senior rite masters, and ratification by the voice of the rite, who was the Ascendancy's supreme theological authority, and also, not coincidentally, its head of state. Earth had been formally designated a fallen world under the doctrine of sacred ruin 11 days before first platform fired. The designation had been coming for 3 years. I know this because I covered the diplomatic process for those 3 years, and I reported each stage of it in dispatches that went out to an audience that did not want to believe what they were reading. The Ascendancy's initial petition had been filed with the Galactic Compact's Legal Mediation Bureau as a doctrinal matter, a request for recognition of theological jurisdiction over a territory the Ascendancy claimed had been spiritually contaminated by human habitation. The Compact's bureau had reviewed it for 18 months and returned a finding that the designation was not justiciable under Compact law because the Compact's charter did not recognize theological jurisdiction over inhabited worlds occupied by registered species. This was the correct finding. It was also nearly useless because the Ascendancy was not asking permission. What the Ascendancy was asking, over those 3 years of diplomatic process, was time. Time to lobby the Compact's member delegations. Time to negotiate the insertion of a single clause into the Compact's emergency response protocol. A clause specifying that in the event of a formally designated doctrinal action by a member state, all other member states would refrain from armed intervention for a minimum of 10 standard days pending Compact review. The Ascendancy called this the theological non-interference provision. They had good lawyers, and their good lawyers presented it as a protection for all member state religions, a guarantee that no fleet could be sent to interfere with any member's legitimate spiritual practices during an initial 10-day review window. Earth's delegation had objected. The objection was noted and filed. The provision passed anyway because the Ascendancy had spent 3 years building the votes for it, and because the other delegations had not understood or had not wanted to understand what the provision was actually for. I had understood. I had written 4 dispatches explaining what it was for. The dispatches were published. They were read. They did not change the outcome. So on the first day of the Rite, I was on a civilian transit shuttle in low orbit, returning from a filing assignment at the Off-World Correspondence Station at Relay Hub 12, and I watched the first kinetic column deliver its payload to the continent below. And I pressed my recording stud, and I began to make the record that I intended to survive whatever happened in the next 9 days. I should tell you about the broadcast. The Ascendancy streamed the cleansing rite live to every receiver in their home system. I know this because my equipment was sensitive enough to pick up the sideband leak of their transmission frequencies even through the relay blackout, and because another correspondent, a man named Declan Voss, who had been embedded with an Ascendancy Civil Affairs unit for an unrelated story, later provided the full archive of the broadcast after being recovered from his evac capsule. From Declan's archive and my own intercepts, I can describe the broadcast with precision. The Rites broadcast was produced with considerable technical sophistication. It ran continuously for 9 days on the Ascendancy's principal devotional channel. The primary feed showed the orbital delivery platforms against the backdrop of Earth's daylit atmosphere. The platforms themselves were painted in the Ascendancy's ceremonial colors, a deep arterial red with gold filament work on the deployment rails, and they were genuinely beautiful in the way that objects are sometimes beautiful when the people who built them cared about their aesthetics and not at all about what those aesthetics were in service of. The platforms rotated slowly in their geosynchronous orbits, and the sunlight caught the gold. Filament and the broadcast's production team had clearly spent considerable time and money achieving a visual that their audience would find both sacred and aesthetically satisfying, the Rite Masters narrated. There were 6 of them in rotating shifts, and they spoke in the low, measured cadences used in formal Thurval religious practice, and they explained to their audience what was happening and why it was necessary, and what the cleansing meant for the spiritual health of the sector, and for the Thurval people, and for the cosmic order that the Ascendancy served. They used the word mercy 27 times in the first day's broadcast. I counted. I counted because the word required precision and because I wanted the record to contain exactly how many times they used it. Between narration segments, the broadcast showed archival footage of Earth, cities, markets, schools, children playing in outdoor spaces. The Rite Masters explained that these images represented the weight of unreconciled life that had accumulated on this world over its inhabited centuries, the density of spiritual contamination that made the cleansing necessary. They did not show the kinetic columns. The impacts did not appear in the Ascendancy's broadcast. The audience watching their devotional channel saw the beautiful platforms and the archival footage of human life and heard 6 Rite Masters explain what was happening below, but they were not shown what a kinetic column does to the place where it arrives. I was shown what a kinetic column does. By the second day, I had moved to the viewport and I did not move away from it for the remainder of the 9 days except to use the shuttle's lavatory and to accept the emergency rations that the Kinneret's 2 crew members, a pilot named Osi Frempa and a navigator named Mira Chudhuri, brought to me at irregular intervals when they could bear to enter the cabin where I was watching. I did not eat much. I drank what they brought. I pressed the recording stud and I described what I saw in the flat instrumental language that I had spent 22 years developing because it was the only tool I had. Mira Chudhuri sat with me on the 3rd day, on the 4th, on the 7th. She did not say much. She was 29 years old and she had grown up in a coastal city on the eastern continent. And her family was in that city, and she did not know, because no communications were passing through the relay blackout, whether the Eastern Continental Corridor had been targeted on any of the days she had not been able to watch. She sat with me at the viewport in silence, and I think we were both grateful for the silence because there was nothing useful to say, and the silence was at least honest. I will not give you every day in the same detail because the record I made already covers them, and its detail is sufficient. But I will give you enough that the 9 days are real to you in the way they were real to me, because I think you need that if you are going to understand what came after. On the 2nd day, the platforms targeted the Western Industrial Corridor, and the morning dispatch from the Rightmaster's broadcast used the phrase, spiritual weight of accumulated habitation, by which they meant the human beings who had built their lives in that valley over 4 generations, and who were, by the 2nd day's platforms, no longer there. I noted the phrase in my record and flagged it for language analysis. The Rightmasters were careful with language. They had a lexicon for what they were doing, a whole architecture of theological vocabulary designed to render each action describable in terms that would not trouble their audience. I found this careful also. Everything about the right was careful in the way that things are careful when the people doing them have decided that they are righteous and want the execution to reflect that righteousness. On the 3rd day, there was a longer pause than usual between the primary column and the ceiling sweep, nearly 6 hours, and I wrote in my record that I did not know what had caused the pause. I theorized platform recalibration. I theorized a targeting review. I later learned from the Compact Investigation Commission that the pause was liturgical. There was a set of ceremonial observances that the doctrine of sacred ruin required between the primary delivery and the sealing, and those observances took approximately 5 hours to complete. The Rightmasters used that time to read a long formal text into the broadcast, something from the Ascendancy's foundational scriptures about the nature of reconciliation and the mercy implicit in the act of cleansing. The text was old. It had been written by a theologian who had died more than 2 centuries before any human being had left Earth's atmosphere, in a culture that had never encountered another species and had built its entire understanding of cosmic order around the assumption that the Thirval were the only form of life that mattered. The text was beautiful in the way ancient things are sometimes beautiful, old rhythms, serious intent, the weight of the centuries behind it. They read it while the previous impact zone cooled. On the 4th day, Mira Chudhuri sat with me for the longest stretch, 4.5 hours. We did not speak for most of it. She had a photograph on her tablet of her parents' house. A low building with a walled garden, white walls, blue tile work on the doorstep. And she had positioned the tablet on the ledge below the viewport so that the photograph and the viewport were in the same field of vision, and I understood what she was doing, and I did not say anything about it because there was nothing to say. Her family was in a city that had not been targeted in the first 3 days. This was what she had. The targeting had not yet reached that corridor. She was holding on to that. On the 6th day, the Eastern Continental Corridor was targeted. It was not the city where Mira's family lived. The Eastern Corridor was 700 kilometers north of that city. But when the sealing sweep completed on the 6th day, Mira did not come to the cabin for the rest of that day and most of the 7th. Osi brought me rations. He was a quiet man by disposition, the kind of person who expressed care through practical action rather than conversation. And he had been expressing it consistently for 6 days, appearing with food and water at intervals calculated to keep me functional, checking the shuttle's positioning relative to the platforms without being asked, managing the hull's passive sensor suite to give me the best possible visual resolution through the viewport. On the 7th day, he told me he had a brother in a city in the southern corridor that had not yet been targeted, and that he was watching the targeting progression, the way you watch a thing moving towards something you love, unable to act, only able to watch. He said this in the same flat, quiet tone I used in my dispatches. Then he went back to the cockpit. I added his name and what he had said to the record. On the 8th day, the Rightmasters broadcast ran a segment on the history of Fallen World designations, of which there had been 4 in the Ascendancy's history, 3 involving uninhabited worlds designated as spiritually contaminated by proximity to Thurval cultural artifacts, and 1 involving a colony world of a species that had since been absorbed into the Ascendancy as client citizens, though the broadcast did not use that term. The broadcast described the precedent with satisfaction as a demonstration that the doctrine of sacred ruin was a living practice with deep historical roots, not an improvisation. I noted this in my record. It struck me as significant that they had chosen to broadcast the historical precedent on the 8th day, when the rite was nearly complete, rather than on the 1st or 2nd, when it might have seemed like justification. By the 8th day, they were not justifying, they were historicizing. They were already telling the story of what they had done. I found this the most troubling thing I witnessed in 9 days of troubling things, more troubling than the platforms and more troubling than the ceiling sweeps. The fact that by the 8th day, they were already composing the history. On the 9th day, I have told you what happened. Let me add one detail I left out because I was not sure where to put it, and I have decided it belongs here. On the 9th day, at 0422, when the final ceiling sweep completed, I was at the viewport. The viewport showed me Earth's atmosphere in the local dawn, the Terminator line crossing the target zone, the slow brightening of the continent below as the sun climbed. The damage was not visible from 380 kilometers in the way that individual buildings are not visible from 380 kilometers. What was visible was the absence of certain kinds of light. Cities at night from that altitude are visible as clusters of light. In the pre-dawn hours of the 9th day, crossing the Terminator, I could see that several of the light clusters that had been there on the first morning were not there anymore. I pressed my recording stud and described this. Then I stopped the recording and I sat for a while without the recording running, which I had not done at any point in the previous 9 days. And I looked at the places where the lights were not, and I let myself be a human being in the dark for a while before I went back to being a correspondent. What I will say is this. The Ascendancy targeted 11 population corridors across 4 continents. The targeting was methodical. Each corridor received a primary kinetic column delivered from the orbital platforms, and then a secondary confirmation sweep, which the Rightmasters referred to in their broadcast as the ceiling, the delivery of a second wave of impactors to ensure what they termed the completion of spiritual reconciliation in the affected zone. The ceiling strikes were smaller and more numerous than the primary columns. They were intended, I believe, to ensure that nothing large enough to move survived in the primary zone. The Ascendancy was meticulous. This is the word I kept returning to in my dispatches. Meticulous. They had planned this for 3 years, and they executed it with the care of people who believed they were doing something sacred. The targeting coordinates for each corridor had clearly been surveyed in advance. The delivery timing was spaced to allow the previous impact zone's thermal bloom to stabilize before the next column was released, which I understood after the 3rd day was a practical measure to ensure the platform's optical targeting systems were not degraded by heat distortion. Even in this, they were careful. On the 5th day, Osei Frempa came to the cabin and told me quietly that he had managed to get one short burst transmission out through a gap in the relay blackout during a platform rotation window. He had transmitted our position and status to the emergency civil defense relay at Waystation 44. He did not know if it had been received. I thanked him. He nodded and went back to the cockpit. I pressed my recording stud and added his name and what he had done to the record because it seemed important that the record contain the name of the person who had found the gap. On the 8th day, the Ascendancy's Voice of the Right delivered a formal homily on the devotional channel. I could not hear the words through my intercept. The carrier frequency was too degraded, but Declan Voss's archive later gave me the text. The voice of the right said that the Thirval people should feel neither guilt nor sorrow at the completion of the cleansing rite, because guilt and sorrow were responses appropriate to harm, and no harm had been done. What had been done was restoration. The fallen world had been reconciled to cosmic order through the only process the doctrine of sacred ruin recognized as legitimate. The spiritual contamination had been addressed. The sector was healthier. The Thirval people had performed their sacred obligation and could face their God with clear conscience. The voice of the right's homily lasted 41 minutes. I sat at the viewport and watched the 9th platform complete its ceiling sweep of the 11th corridor, and I pressed my recording stud and I said, Day 8, 20:143 hours. The final ceiling sweep of the 11th target zone is complete. Visual analysis of the affected zones over the past 8 days suggests that the kinetic delivery program has been executed as planned. I am unable to determine precise casualty figures from this altitude. I estimate based on pre-write population data and strike density that the figure is significant. I will not speculate further. The record will eventually have access to better data than I do. I did not say what I was actually thinking, because what I was actually thinking was not useful for the record. What I was thinking was that I had spent 8 days watching 6 million human beings be killed in the name of someone else's God, and that the people doing it had called it mercy and restoration and a sacred obligation, and that the only instrument I had in my hands was a correspondence tag and a dead channel, and that I intended to survive the 9th day and file every word of what I had recorded into every archive on Earth that still had receivers, and that I also intended, and this was not a correspondence thought, this was a human thought, and I let myself have it, that I intended to be alive when the Compact's 10-day non-intervention window expired. Because there was a fleet. I want to be precise about the fleet. Earth had built it in the 3 years of the diplomatic process, in the period when I was filing dispatches that people were reading and not changing their votes on. Earth had built it not because anyone wanted to believe the ascendancy would actually execute the right, but because there were people in Earth's Emergency Defense Council who had read the same documents I had read and drawn the same conclusions, and those people had quietly pushed through a supplemental construction authorization and had not called it what it was, because calling it what it was would have alarmed the ascendancy before the fleet was ready and would have given the ascendancy reason to claim that Earth was militarizing against a diplomatic process, which would have damaged Earth's position in the Compact's review of the theological non-interference provision. So the fleet had been built quietly in dispersed dry dock facilities across 4 systems, and it had been named in internal council documents as the Emergency Compact Response Force, which was a name that meant nothing and was designed to mean nothing. I had known about it in outline because I had sources in the council and because I was a person who made it my work to know things. I had not reported it publicly for the same reason the council had not publicized it. Because if the ascendancy learned the fleet existed and understood what it was, they would either accelerate their timetable or use its existence to poison the Compact's diplomatic review. I had sat on the biggest story of my career for 8 months because I calculated that the fleet existing was more important than the story. I spent some time on the 4th day and the 5th and the 7th asking myself whether that calculation had been correct. I did not reach a clean answer. I am not sure there is a clean answer. I know what the fleet was being built for, and I know what it was eventually used for, and I believe that what it was used for was necessary and correct. And I also know that I sat on a story for 8 months, and that during those 8 months, the ascendancy was finalizing its targeting coordinates, and I am not able to fully separate those 2 facts. I carry them both. I do not expect to put them down. On the 9th day at 0422, the ascendancy's orbital platforms completed the final ceiling sweep of the final target zone. The cleansing rite was complete at 0614 on the 9th day, exactly 24 hours before the Compact's 10-day non-intervention window would expire, because the ascendancy had been meticulous about their timing as about everything else. The voice of the right delivered a closing address on the devotional channel. He declared the sector healed. he declared the Thurval people vindicated. He declared that the doctrine of sacred ruin had been fulfilled for the first time in 300 years, and that this fulfillment was a gift to all sentient life in the sector, whether or not they yet had the spiritual clarity to recognize it as such. He thanked his people for their faith. Then the broadcast ended. At 0641, 17 minutes later, the Compact's emergency civil defense relay at Waystation 44 received OC, Frempaw's compressed transmission from 8 days earlier, confirming our position and status. The relay had been looking for us. The relay had been looking for any civilian vessel in the target zone, and it had been running continuous sweep protocols since the morning of the second day, when Earth's Emergency Defense Council had received the Ascendancy's formal notification of the right's commencement and convened in emergency session. I know what happened in that session because I requested the transcripts afterward, and they were declassified 18 months later, and I read all 412 pages of them. I will give you the relevant portion. The council's session lasted 11 hours and 14 minutes. The first 2 hours were devoted to establishing the casualty estimates, not precise figures, because the relay blackout and the targeting scope made precision impossible in real time, but working estimates sufficient to understand the scale. The council's technical assessment team presented their analysis at hour 2. They put the preliminary estimate at between 4 and 7 million confirmed dead. They noted that this figure was preliminary and that the final figure would be higher. The council spent 11 minutes in silence after the assessment team finished. Then the session chair, a woman named Director Amara Solano Briggs, said, "What are the legal mechanisms for revocation of the theological non-interference provision under Article 17 of the Compact Emergency?" "Protocol?" the council's legal advisor answered. "Under Article 17, any Compact member state subject to an action covered by the provision had the unilateral right to revoke it for themselves, effective immediately, with notification to the Compact Secretariat. The revocation took effect upon notification, not upon Secretariat acknowledgement. Notification could be transmitted in any medium." Director Solano Briggs said, "Transmit the notification." The legal advisor transmitted the notification at hour 2 minute 14. The Earth delegation's message to the Compact Secretariat read as follows in its entirety. Earth hereby revokes the theological non-interference provision as applied to actions directed against Earth, pursuant to Article 17 of the Emergency Response Protocol, effective immediately. The Compact Secretariat is notified accordingly. That took 43 words. The Council spent the remaining 9 hours of the session on fleet authorization and deployment orders. The fleet had been built in stages, and the first 4 stages were complete. The 5th stage, the final construction tranche, was approximately 80% assembled at the time the session convened. The Council authorized the immediate deployment of the first 4 stages and the integration of the 5th stage vessels. As they cleared their dock, certifications with a rendezvous protocol to be established en route. The first 4 stages comprised 381,000 warships. The 5th stage would add an additional 79,000 vessels. The combined fleet, the full Pale verdict, would comprise 460,000 warships. Director Solano Briggs signed the deployment authorization at hour 11. She did not make a speech. The session transcripts record that she signed the document, set down her stylus, and said, "Move them." Then she adjourned the session. I did not know any of this while it was happening. I was at the viewport of Shuttle Kinneret watching the last ceiling sweep complete itself against the curve of a continent. I had been awake for most of the 9 days. I was using the flat instrumental language to make the record, and I was also, at the same time, a human being who had spent 9 days watching her world be killed, and those two things were not always compatible, and I had spent some time on each of the 9 days making sure the flat instrumental language stayed in control of the human being, because the human being's reactions were not useful, and the record was. At 1100 on the 9th day, with the non-intervention window still showing 13 hours to expiration on my correspondence tag, the Ascendancy's 9 orbital platforms began moving. Not out of orbit. They were moving into a formation I had not seen them occupy before. A close grouping in geosynchronous position, over the primary strike zone from the first day. I pressed my recording stud and described the movement and noted that I did not know what it indicated. At 11:47, Mira Shudhari came to the cabin and told me that OSE had picked up a signal on the civil defense emergency frequency, not a message, a handshake tone, the automated identification ping of an Earth Defense Fleet vessel. Then two pings, then a sequence that meant acknowledged, in system, stand by. I asked her how many pings there had been in total. She said she had stopped counting after the first 100 because OSE had told her the counter was going to take a while to run up. I held her hand for a moment. She let me. Then I pressed my recording stud and I said, 11:47 hours, 9th day. I am receiving reports of Earth Defense Fleet ping traffic on the Civil Defense channel. I have not confirmed the fleet designation or the count. I am standing by for further information. I paused the recording. Then I started it again and I said, I should note for the record that I am finding it difficult to maintain the flat, instrumental language at this moment, and that I am aware this is not typical for my dispatches, and that I believe the record should contain this acknowledgement. Then I went back to the flat instrumental language and I described the continued movement of the Ascendancy's platforms, and I waited. What I learned later, and what I now know precisely, is this. The pale verdict emerged from transit at the edge of the Thurval system at 12:03 on the 9th day. The transemergence was staggered across a 7-minute window because bringing 460,000 warships out of fold transit simultaneously was not tactically advisable, and the fleet's operations planners had instead designed a rolling emergence protocol in which the vessels arrived in wave sequences, each wave clearing the emergence corridor before the next folded through. The effect, observed from outside the system, and several neutral party observation vessels were present because the compact's member delegations had been tracking the situation, and most of them had positioned observation assets in the outer system once. The right's commencement had been formally notified, was of a tide coming in, not a wave, not a crash, a tide. An incremental, inexorable filling up of the space at the system's edge with angular dark-hulled warships that caught the system's sun on their dorsal plating and reflected it back in long ribbons of light. The observation vessel logs, which I reviewed during my research after the events, described the emergence in various ways. One navigator's log said simply, "They are still coming." It said this 27 times over the 7-minute emergence window, once per wave sequence, as a factual status report. I kept that log. It seemed to me to contain the essential truth of the moment. The fleet's lead elements, 6 heavy dreadnoughts designated as the Pale Verdicts, Command and Communications Wing, decelerated to establish their position at the inner boundary of the system's outer marker zone and transmitted a single broadcast on all open frequencies. The broadcast was addressed to the voice of the right and to the high sanctum of the Thurval Ascendancy, and it identified the transmitting authority as the Earth Emergency Defense Fleet, designation Pale Verdict, operating under the full authorization of Earth's Emergency Defense Council and the revoked theological non-interference provision pursuant to Article 17. The broadcast then contained the following, which I will give you verbatim because these are public record and I do not need to paraphrase them. The Pale Verdict carries 460,000 warships to the Thurval home system. This force represents Earth's response to the 9-day kinetic bombardment of 11 population corridors across Earth's surface, conducted by the Thurval Ascendancy under the designation Cleansing Rite, which resulted in 6.3 million confirmed dead. Earth does not recognize the doctrine of sacred ruin, the designation of fallen world, or the theological jurisdiction claimed by the Ascendancy over any territory Earth occupies. Earth recognizes that 6.3 million human beings are dead. The Pale Verdict has been authorized to answer accordingly. This broadcast is transmitted once. There will be no further communication. That was the full content of the broadcast. I was told later by people who had been monitoring Ascendancy communications that the voice of the right attempted to reply 17 times between the broadcast's conclusion and the moment the Pale Verdict's lead elements crossed the inner system marker. The replies were not received by any Earth vessel because the Pale Verdict's communication arrays had been set to transmit only following the initial broadcast. This was not an oversight. It was an instruction in the deployment authorization. The Ascendancy's military fleet moved to defensive formation within 40 minutes of the broadcast's transmission. This is what I would have expected from a fleet of 31,000 warships defending their home system. They grouped their heavier vessels around the primary inhabited world and stationed their faster units at the approaches. And they issued their own broadcast on military channels announcing that the Ascendancy's fleets would defend the sanctity of the cleansing rite and the sovereignty of the Thurval home system against unlawful aggression. I reviewed that broadcast later. It was formally composed and transmitted by an officer named Fleet Commander Vareth of the Ascendancy's First Sanctum Guard, and it contained the word lawful or its cognate 6 times in 4 paragraphs. Fleet Commander Vareth was, by all subsequent accounts, an able officer who had trained for exactly this kind of defensive engagement, and who had, I think, some private understanding of what the mathematics of 31,000 against 460,000 actually meant, and who transmitted his broadcast and positioned his vessels and did his duty with the seriousness that duty deserves. The engagement began at 1339 and ended at 0034 the following day. 11 hours. I have seen the engagement logs, and I have spoken to officers from the Pale Verdict's tactical wing, and what I can tell you is that the engagement was executed with the same methodical precision that characterized everything else about the Pale. Verdict from the moment it emerged from transit. The fleet's Operaslang's planners had prepared the tactical framework during the transit, knowing the Ascendancy's fleet composition and likely defensive positioning from intelligence assets that had been monitoring the system. The Pale Verdict engaged in wave sequences, not the full 460,000 at once, which would have been both unnecessary and tactically incoherent, but organized assault groups of 20 to 40,000 vessels each, rotating through contact with the Ascendancy's defensive positions in a sequence designed to deny the Ascendancy any period of recovery or reorganization. The assault groups were commanded by flag officers who had trained together for 2 years in anticipation of exactly this engagement. They communicated in a command language that had been developed for this fleet and this purpose. The engagement was not chaotic. It was precise. I was told by one officer, a woman named Wing Commander Priya Sundaram, who commanded the Pale Verdict's 3rd assault rotation, that the engagement felt less like a battle and more like a procedure. She did not say this with satisfaction. She said it with the flat, careful tone of someone reporting a fact that does not require embellishment and does not benefit from it. She said, "We had done it in simulation 400 times. The real thing was very close to the simulation." I asked her if that was reassuring. She thought about it. She said, "It meant we didn't make errors. That was what we needed. Reassuring isn't the word I would use." I asked her what word she would use. She said, "Correct. It was correct. I wrote that down. I have thought about it since." I think she was right that correct is not the same as reassuring, and I think she knew the difference and named it precisely on purpose. I had asked Director Solano Briggs at a press briefing 9 months later whether she had considered allowing the Voice of the Right's replies to be received. She had looked at me for a moment before answering. She was a small woman with a face that had been carrying something heavy for a long time, and the weight was visible in the way she carried herself, in the set of her shoulders and the lines at the corners of her eyes. She said, "He had 9 days to say what he needed to say. He said it to his own people. He put it on a broadcast and he sent it home. We received his broadcast. We counted its words. I did not ask a follow-up question. Some answers closed the subject. I want to tell you what the Pale Verdict did, and I want to be precise about it, because precision is the only form of honesty available to me here, and I owe this account the same honesty I owed every other account I ever filed, including the ones where the honesty cost me something. The Pale Verdict did not target the Thurval civilian population. This is the first thing to say clearly and to say first, because the Pale Verdict was not a vengeance action, and it was not an atrocity in answer to an atrocity. It was a response. The distinction matters, and it was maintained throughout. The fleet's targeting authorization, as detailed in the deployment orders I later reviewed, specified 4 categories of legitimate target. The 9 orbital delivery platforms that had conducted the rite, the Ascendancy's military fleet in total, the Ascendancy's military and governmental infrastructure, and the Ascendancy's command and communications architecture, including the High Sanctum's operational facilities, civilian population centers, civilian infrastructure, and non-military industrial facilities were explicitly excluded from targeting authorization. I want to be honest about what the distinction meant in practice. The Thurval home system contained 3 inhabited worlds and 2 major orbital habitats. The Ascendancy's military infrastructure was interwoven with the habitation and industrial infrastructure of those worlds in the way that military infrastructure always is, and the Pale Verdict's targeting was precise, but precision at that scale has limits. The Compact's Investigation Commission, which I also covered, estimated that the destruction of Ascendancy, military, and governmental infrastructure resulted in secondary losses among the civilian population in the range of 200 to 300,000 individuals. I am giving you the Commission's estimate because it is the best available figure, and because leaving it out would not be precision, it would be evasion. What the Pale Verdict destroyed directly was the following: 9 orbital delivery platforms, the Ascendancy's full military fleet of approximately 31,000 warships, which the Ascendancy had positioned in defensive formation around the homeworld upon receiving the Pale Verdict's broadcast, and which the Pale Verdict engaged and defeated in a period of approximately 3 hours. The High Sanctum's operational complex on the primary inhabited world, the Ascendancy's 17 military command stations across the 3 inhabited worlds, the Ascendancy's communications relay architecture, and the Ascendancy's principal defense installations. The engagement lasted 11 hours from first contact to the cessation of organized resistance. The Pale Verdict lost 4 warships with crew. I know their names. I am not including them here because their families and their unit records have the right to that information first and in full, not as a number in a correspondence account. I will say that they are in the record I filed and that the record gives them their full due. When the Ascendancy's organized resistance ceased, the Pale Verdict's Operations Command transmitted a second broadcast. This broadcast informed the surviving civilian and governmental leadership of the Thurval Ascendancy that the Pale Verdict's targeting authorization was exhausted, that no further military action was authorized, and that the Pale Verdict would withdraw from the system on a specified schedule. The broadcast identified one condition on the withdrawal: a single member of the High Sanctum would be taken into Earth custody, not for punishment, not for trial, though a compact tribunal process would follow later, as a witness. As the records evidence that the rite had been conducted, that Earth had answered, and that both facts existed. The individual taken into custody was the 6th Rite Master, the one who had completed the narration shift during the first kinetic column's delivery on the first day of the 9 days. I do not know who in the Operations Command made that specific selection. I think it was chosen for its precision. I was there for the withdrawal. I want to explain how I got there. When Mira Chudhuri told me about the defense channel pings on the 9th day, I had made a decision that I recognized as probably outside the scope of what a correspondent was supposed to do. I had asked Osi Frempa to transmit a credentialing request to the Pale Verdict's flagship through the Civil Defense Channel. A credentialing request from a correspondent embedded on a civilian vessel in the active zone of the offense. I had my correspondence authorization on file with Earth's Emergency Information Bureau, and the Bureau's emergency credentialing protocol allowed for real-time field authorization in circumstances where correspondent access was in the public interest. I was, I thought, a correspondent who had spent 9 days watching something that the public needed to know had been watched. I thought the Pale Verdict's withdrawal needed a witness, and I thought I was the right witness, because I had been watching since the first day. The authorization came back in 2 hours. EFS Kinneret's Answer, a heavy cruiser that had been named, I learned later, by its crew, using the name of the shuttle that had survived the 9 days in the target zone, rendezvoused with our shuttle at 1830 on the 9th day, with the engagement still ongoing below us, and I transferred across in a personnel pod with my correspondence tag and 4 days of dispatch backlog, and the record that I had been making since 0614 on the first morning. The captain of F's Kinneret's answer was a man named Fleet Commander Arun Balakandran. He was 53 years old, and he had a stillness about him that I recognized as a specific kind of exhaustion. Not physical exhaustion, but the exhaustion that comes from holding something at a controlled distance for a very long time and not being able to set it down until the thing is finished. He greeted me on the flight deck, gave me a brief account of the engagement status, and told me I had access to the bridge and the observation deck and to any crew member willing to speak to me. He said this without hesitation, and I asked him later if he had been instructed to give me access or if he had decided it himself. He said both. The deployment authorization included a press pool provision, and I decided myself. I asked him what he meant. He said, "Someone should be here. Someone should watch this and write it down. I watched your emergency transmission from the first day. We all did. Once we were in system and the blackout wasn't a factor. Your dispatch from the first day. I wanted to make sure you got to finish filing." I did not say anything for a moment. He did not say anything either. We were both looking out the flight deck viewport at the engagement below us, at the distant flicker of weapons exchange against the curve of a planet that was not Earth, and the Pale Verdict's 460,000 warships were a presence in the space around us that I cannot adequately describe. 460,000 is a number that is too large to be fully perceived at any single moment. You perceive it in pieces. You perceive it in the way a warship the size of a city block drifts into your field of vision, and then another follows it, and then another, and then you look to the side, and there are more, and you look to the other side, and there are more, and you understand that this extends in every direction around you as far as you can resolve with the naked eye, and that beyond the range of your naked eye there are more, and that the number 460,000 is not an abstraction but a physical reality that fills the space you are in and does not stop. I had been a correspondent for 22 years. I had developed precise language for most things I had encountered. I did not have precise language for that. Balakandran stood with me for a few minutes at the viewport. He was a methodical man. I would learn this about him over the days we shared his ship. Methodical in the way that people who have given careful thought to what they are doing are methodical, not in the way that people who are avoiding thought are methodical. He had been in the fleet for 31 years. He had commanded 3 vessels before this one. He had been selected for the Pale Verdict's command rotation 18 months before the deployment, at which point the fleet's existence had been known to a very small circle, and the deployment had been understood by that circle as possible, but not yet authorized. He had spent 18 months preparing for a command he did not know he would actually be given. I asked him at one point, this was the second day, when the engagement was still running, and we had time to talk in the brief periods when tactical priorities allowed it, whether he had believed during those 18 months that it would actually happen. He said, I believed it might. I prepared as though it would. I found I couldn't afford to think about it too much in other terms. I asked him what he meant by other terms. He said, whether it was the right call, whether the fleet was the right answer. I had to set that aside and focus on the preparation, because the preparation was my job. The call belonged to someone else, I said. And now that you're in it? He was quiet for a moment. He looked at the viewport. He said, now it's my job to execute it well, which is a different question from whether it was the right call, and I can answer it. I can answer it right now, today, by doing the work correctly. He went back to the bridge shortly after that. I stayed at the viewport and wrote down what he had said and thought about the distinction he was drawing. It seemed to me that it was a real distinction and that he had lived inside it for a long time and that it had cost him something to maintain and that the cost was part of what the exhaustion in his face was about. I stayed on E.F.'s Kinneret's answer through the cessation of organized resistance and through the second broadcast and through the custody transfer of the 6th Right Master. I watched the custody transfers through the ship's external optical array. The Right Master was brought aboard on a personnel shuttle full from the primary world's surface, escorted by 2 fleet marines in dress uniforms rather than combat kit, which I believe was a deliberate choice. He was placed in the ship's secure detention facility, which was clean and correctly supplied under compact detainee protocol, and I was not given access to the facility because press access to detainees in initial custody was not authorized under the credentialing protocol, and I did not ask for it. I filed 7 dispatches from EFS Kinneret's answer. I want to be honest about the state I was in when I filed them. I was very tired, and I had not slept more than 2 hours in any given period for 9 days, and I was sitting in the press pool alcove off the main observation deck, and I was filing into a live channel for the first time in 9 days. And there was something about the live channel being open, the fact that what I was typing was going out in real time and would be received. That was harder to manage than I had expected. The flat, instrumental language was still there. I did not lose it. But I was aware of the effort in a way I had not been aware of it during the 9 days when the channel was dead. Because during those 9 days as I had been filing into the void, and the void does not react. And you do not have to hold yourself steady against the void's reaction. The 7th dispatch was the one I had been composing in my head since the first morning. I had been composing it for 9 days, filing it into my memory the way I filed the others into the dead channel, because I had known that if I survived, I would need to file it, and I had wanted it to be right. It was a description of what I had witnessed, all 9 days of it. The kinetic columns and the ceiling sweeps and the Right Master's narration and Mira Choudhury sitting with me at the viewport, and O.C. Frempa finding the gap in the relay blackout and the number of times the word mercy had appeared in the Ascendancy's broadcast. The platforms rotating in the sun with their gold filament work. The way the terminal flash of a kinetic strike registers from 380 kilometers up, like a brief brightening that lasts 2 seconds and then spreads. I did not put any of my thoughts about the Pale Verdict's response into the 7th dispatch. I described it, but I did not editorialize it. I have never believed that editorial judgment should contaminate the primary record, and the primary record of those 9 days was already too important to contaminate. I could editorialize in a separate filing, and I did, a longer analytical piece that I spent 3 weeks writing after I got home, which went through 4 editorial reviews and a legal review before it was published, and which I stand by completely. What I will tell you now, in this account, which is not a dispatch but a retrospective, is what I think about the Pale Verdict, in the plain terms that I spent 22 years of dispatching learning not to use, and that I find I am now able to use because the events are complete and the record is stable, and I owe you my opinion as well as my precision. I think the Pale Verdict was an answer commensurate to the act. I want to say that carefully because I know it will be received in different ways by different people, and I have spent enough time in this work to know that my saying it does not settle the question. The question of whether 460,000 warships was the correct instrument for answering what the Ascendancy did is a question that compact scholars, military ethicists, and people who lost family on both sides of those 11 days will argue for generations, and they should argue it. The argument is important. I am not trying to close it. What I am saying is simpler than that. I am saying that I watched 9 days of it from a viewport 380 kilometers up, and I watched Fleet Commander Balacondron's face when the cessation of resistance report came in, and I watched the 6th Right Master step off the custody shuttle with his ceremonial robes still on. And I have spent a long time since then looking at what the Pale Verdict did and what it did not do. And what I think is that the people who built it and the people who authorized it and the people who flew it were trying to answer a specific thing with a specific instrument, and they did not exceed the instrument's authorization. And they did not turn the instrument into something uglier than it needed to be. I think Director Solano Briggs signed that authorization and said, move them, and meant it with the full weight of what she knew. And I think she knew the weight precisely because she had the same assessment team's numbers that I eventually saw in the declassified transcripts. And the assessment team had said between 4 and 7 million, and the final figure was 6.3 million. And she had known that before she signed, and she had signed anyway, because the alternative was to not answer, and not answering was also a choice, and not answering had its own costs, and she had looked at both costs and made her decision. I think that is what the Pale Verdict was, a decision made by a person who had looked at both costs. I filed the 7th dispatch, and I closed my tag, and I went to the observation deck, and I looked out at 460,000 warships beginning their withdrawal sequence. And I thought about the 9 orbital platforms rotating in the Thurval sun with their gold filament work catching the light, and about the voice of the Right's closing address, thanking his people for their faith, and about Mira Chudhuri's family in the coastal city on the eastern continent, and about the 6.3 million, and about the 200 to 300,000, and about the 4 warships and their crews. And I did not try to arrange these things into a shape that made them easier to hold. I held them in the shape they were in. On the observation deck, there was a young rating. An enlisted crewman couldn't have been more than 22 or 23, with the kind of face that still looked surprised by things. And he was standing at the viewport, looking out at the withdrawal formation. I stood next to him and looked out with him, and after a while he said, quietly, not to me specifically, just to the viewport and whatever was on the other side of it. "It's a lot of ships," I said. "Yes." He nodded. He didn't say anything else. We stood there together for a while, watching the formation move, watching the warships that were still emerging from behind the planet's limb join the withdrawal sequence, watching the light from the system's sun catch 460,000 hulls and scatter off them in a way that was, like the Ascendancy's platforms had been, genuinely beautiful. If you did not know what it meant, I knew what it meant. Earth had counted its dead and answered with everything that being answered required, and not one thing more. And the pale verdict was withdrawing in good order through the system it had entered 11 hours ago with authorization it had not exceeded. And the 6th Right Master was in a clean cell below decks, and somewhere on the primary world, the voice of the Right was alive and unharmed and in possession of a very specific understanding of what it felt like to watch something you could not stop. I pressed my recording stud one more time. I said, "Observation deck, EF's Kinneret's answer, withdrawal plus 40 minutes. The pale verdict is proceeding on schedule. This is Correspondent Yale Brennan, Earth Emergency Information Bureau, credentialing number EB1147S. This is the final dispatch in this filing series." I paused. Then I said, "The record is complete. I am closing the channel," and I did.